Probably the simplest way to see these levels of interpretation in action is to look at a few typical examples. Our first example describes a person who has high dominance and high influence, while the other factors, steadiness and compliance, aren't strongly represented. How can we interpret a profile with two high factors like this? From the biaxial model, you'll recall that dominance relates to assertiveness and control, while influence relates to assertiveness and openness. For a person whose behaviour combines the two, the emphasis is strongly on assertiveness, which is common to both of these factors. So, we'd expect them to be direct, proactive, and impatient. In terms of openness and control, though, there's a balance at work here. A person with this type of profile is not strongly oriented towards either extreme, and is capable of acting independently or working with others as the situation demands. These combinations of qualities are often needed, for example, in sales roles, and it's no coincidence that the graph shape we're looking at here is often used to select successful salespeople. Another level of DISC analysis comes from the substrates, which look at relations between pairs of factors. For example, in this graph, we see a high dominance score and a low steadiness score. We call this combination D over S for short, and it relates to the subtrait of self-motivation. People with this characteristic tend to show a driving and impatient behavioural style, and as the name suggests, they're motivated by their own success. There are 12 of these subtraits, each relating to a different combination of high and low DISC factors. Here's another DISC example. Again, we have two high factors and two low factors, but in this case, the high dominance score is accompanied by a high compliance score. Because it shares high dominance with our previous example, it's not surprising to find that people of both types share certain characteristics, but there are also some significant differences. Going back to the biaxial model, we can see that the axis where dominance and compliance come together is not assertiveness, but control. And control is indeed the watchword for this graph shape and for the type of person it describes. A person like this will want power over their own conditions, and they can often seek to achieve this through the direct and determined dominant feature of their style. Notice, though, that this style is balanced between assertiveness and receptiveness. For example, in practice, we often find that people with DISC graphs like this one prefer to work within a set of rules, and will do their best to ensure that those around them do so as well. So far, we've just looked at high factors in the profile, but in fact the low factors can often tell us just as much. Notice in this graph, both influence and steadiness are very low, and these are the factors that relate to the social and interpersonal behaviours in our model. This is borne out by experience too. Individuals with this characteristic shape tend to be rather formal and direct in the way that they communicate with others. Like our previous example, you'll notice that this shape also has a high dominance score and a low steadiness score. You'll recall that we related this to the subtrait of self-motivation, and exactly the same quality applies here. In fact, all profiles with this combination of factors can be expected to show self-motivated behaviour. Of course, there are other combinations at work here too. For example, we can also see that compliance is high here, while influence is low. We call this subtrait accuracy, and it relates to the desire for certainty and precision that we've already discussed. Each of the examples that we've seen so far has contained simple high or low factors. In this graph, however, we see DISC factors at various levels in the profile. In fact, in practical use, this is a much more common configuration, though the information that it carries about an individual can be a little more difficult to interpret. Put simply, where factors exist at different levels like this, they can be considered in terms of priority. For example, this graph shows both steadiness and compliance as being relatively high, and that means that we'd expect to see corresponding elements in the person's behaviour. These two factors are often complementary, But because compliance is rather higher than steadiness, it will tend to take priority within a person's behaviour. For instance, if a person like this needed to choose between patience, a steady behaviour, or precision, a compliance behaviour, we would normally expect them to focus on the latter. This sense of priority applies to the substrates as well. For instance, in this profile, we can see that compliance is higher than steadiness. We say C over S, which relates to the substrate we call sensitivity. We can also see that S is over I, which is thoughtfulness, and that I is over D, which is friendliness. So this person can be expected to act in a sensitive, thoughtful, and friendly way. But compare this to the substrate of compliance over dominance, which is huge by comparison. We call this substrate cooperativeness, that is, a willingness to work productively with others. For a person like this, the cooperative aspect of their behaviour will take precedence over all the others.